with us today. How are you?
I am outstanding. Good to see you.
It's great to see you. So, for those of you who do not know Mark, Mark is one of our producers here at Paul, the Last Apostle, and I've had the opportunity to meet him several times. He's super nice guy. All been over the web because we are in distance. But
Mhm.
before I move on with our interview today, I did want to introduce Mark. So, Mark is originally from Northern New York State, which that's where you're at today, right? You're up in New York, right?
I'm in New York. I'm Western New York right now.
Okay, awesome. And you grew up in a large Catholic family. You have French Canadian roots. You've had multiple jobs. And I found that really interesting that you've been advertising, broadcasting, and special education. So that's like a big variety there. But you started as an actor in short film in 2006. And then I think that just kind of gave you the bug, it sounded like, to start writing short film scripts not longer for that. The cool thing I like about Mark, and we've talked before, but he loves to write teleplays and he loves screenplays, and he does it all based on real life stories. So some of the ones you're currently working on is the first I had, like, this is hard to say, soccer style kicker in pro football. I don't say that multiple times fast. And then also you're doing something in a 1920s baseball pitcher who set a World Series strikeout record. Also you're working on like several other projects. So that's just to name a few. You've received multiple nominations for a Lone Star Emmy as Best Children's Program in Texas for a TV series for kids that you created called Houston Superstars Challenge.
Mhm.
And in your free time, you love hanging out at the lakes of Western New York. I've actually been in upstate New York and seen a lake, and it is beautiful there. It's
Mhm.
absolutely beautiful. And something else you like to do is you love history, of course, as we were learning about you, and you like to dive into old newspapers of the 1800s, early 1900s. But one thing I thought was interesting about you, Mark, I mean, all that's interesting, but like the fact that, like, I was asking about you, you said, "Hey, I'm tied to the Iroquois." I'm like, that is amazing. So tell us a little bit about your history. I would love to hear about that.
That's a great place to start. So I wasn't raised with my Mohawk family. My parents divorced when I was very young, and I
Okay.
wasn't raised with them. And so I knew that I was Mohawk. That's about all the information I had. And then when I was around 25 years old, I was working at a radio station in my hometown with somebody who I told that story to. And
Mhm.
she's the kind of person who decided she was going to pick up a Buffalo phone book and find somebody with the name Isaacs in it. And
Mhm.
she put her finger on the name Isaacs and landed on what was my Uncle Dennis.
Oh,
And she
wow.
called them, and I went that weekend and met my Uncle Dennis, and I hadn't seen him since I was a toddler.
Uh-huh.
And I began reconnecting with my Mohawk family. And then since then, gotten to know a lot more of them. And eventually I registered as First Nations in Canada through my grandfather's territory, which is Tyendinaga in Ontario. And my grandmother, my paternal grandmother is from Six Nations, also in Ontario. And I've gotten a chance to visit Six Nations a couple of times since coming to New York. So yeah, that was a kind of a whirlwind thing to all happen very quickly after years of going. I have this heritage out there I know nothing about, and suddenly I'm thrust in the middle of it and learning lots.
Yeah, that is just really cool because, like, no offense, but like looking at you, you wouldn't know that. You know what I mean? Like, just looking at you. But to hear that, I would think that would have been so enlightening to be able, as much as you're a history buff guy, to like really delve into that part of your life.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of support too. Like the person who made that introduction for me has helped me build a family tree and do a lot of research. She's
And that's
somebody who
cool.
specializes in ancestry and genealogy, so she's helped me build a family tree of my Isaacs Mohawk family going back several generations. And actually, my Isaac's name didn't start that long ago. My
Okay.
paternal grandfather was a miracle who was adopted when his mother died young. So my actual Mohawk family name is Miracle, and there's a lot of miracles in Canada that I'm related to.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really neat. I love that little bit about you because I think, like, I'm sure it gives you a whole different perspective on, these different people with different ethnicities and like their minorities and all the things that go with minorities, you know what I mean? So I find that really, really, really cool. So tell me a little bit, like, tell me about your previous work and how you landed here at Paul.
I've gone through this with other people. It's kind of a bit of a bizarre journey that I've just said yes to a lot of things.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I have somebody who was necessarily seeking out any one thing. And so I got into theater when I was in college and I wanted to perform. And I found in the real world, it was easy to get a job in radio. And so I started in radio. And then I went to television. I was working as both a fill in weatherman with no meteorology experience, did some news producing, and then eventually got into program producing in Houston. And again, it was just because I'd done news producing, I got into program producing, and then I started seeing some doors open that I wouldn't have necessarily sought after. But then the next thing I knew, I was producing this kids show that you mentioned, Houston
Oh,
Superstars
that's nice.
Challenge, and getting a chance to create a show that was a bit like Fear Factor, a bit like The Amazing Race, but for middle school kids in Houston. And we shot it all on location. And I think I'd always wanted to be a performer at some point. So when I got into acting, I was wanting to fulfill that desire to perform. But I am much more a storyteller. I'm much more comfortable like being the person who lets other people do the acting,
Mhm.
lets other people help me tell the story that I want to tell. And so I've gotten to experiment in a lot of different mediums that way, going into advertising. The special education was a bit of a twist, though, because that's something that I fell into. I had my daughter in school in Wisconsin, and I said, I'm going to take some hours every week of just helping, helping with lunch and recess. And one of the people in special ed there said, you'd be good at this job. You should think
Mm.
about it. And I said, I never thought about working in special education. And I started right there. I started working in the middle schools and the high schools and worked one-on-one with a kid with who was pre-diagnosed or had not been diagnosed yet with autism. And then it turned into something I did for several years. So those are very different personalities I have. I mean, the educator who works in special education is very different than the
Right.
writer, very different than the actor. And I find some way to stage manage all these personalities as I keep moving forward.
Yeah, but I think that shows that we all could be multifaceted. Like none of us are one dimensional, and so I think that's really neat. So you mentioned your daughter. How many children do you have?
She is one, the one and only.
Okay.
And in some ways, I feel like I'm blessed having one. I do wish that she had a sibling so I could
Mhm.
compare and contrast how different kids are. But she's been such an amazing journey for me. I mean, I think I've learned more from her than she's
Mhm.
learned from me. She's taught me so much. She just finished her first year of college, university at Buffalo, and she's studying sociology and minoring in Indigenous studies, which I'm so proud of.
Wow.
I'm so proud that she made that decision.
That is awesome. That's really neat to see that influenced in her life for sure. So tell me, with all this history and kind of the way things happen, right? Doors open, things go. How did you wind up here with us at Paul the Last Apostle?
Well, I was part of a conversation with a core part of the team when they were going into production on the very early production they were doing in Texas,
Mhm.
and I was interested in being part of the post production at that time, and we began having these conversations about what that might look like. And when it came time to circle the horses again, as they say, or circle the wagons, I guess is the phrase, to come back to it to where we are now, my hat was always in the ring. My heart was always in the project. And even if, they were moving on with other people and going in other directions, I remember specifically telling Oscar, like, I'm supporting you. I'm rooting for you all the way. Whether I'm involved or not is immaterial. If I get to be involved, that's great. And when the opportunity came, when the door opened up again, I'm like, I'm there. I am there. I'm excited. It's probably more historical than I'm used to writing. I mean, I'm used to writing about the 1800s and 1900s. I'm used to working on projects that are set in the not so distant past. So this one was an opportunity to go. We get to dig deep. We get to go way back, which for me is even more exciting to think about the life and times of a man that probably not a lot of people really today know a
Mhm.
great deal about. And then again, it's kind of tied to my other storytelling. It's me as an untold story that people absolutely need to hear in 2024 and beyond.
Oh, I love that. That's so good because, Ulysses, I interviewed him a few weeks ago and I brought it up last week when I interviewed Jordan, but like he said something to me that's just been sitting with me. He's like, Lauren, Paul is this guy that what church service do you not go to that you hear something he wrote? You know, but how many of us actually, I mean, my question is, but how many of actually know him? Like his personality, his character, the real human side of Paul. Like I think it's easy to like read scripture and like look at it. And I mean, we're just as guilty of doing it with anybody else in the Bible. Like, oh, that was then. And we're like, we forget that they're a person who had real issues and real things and real struggles. And so I love that you're like, this is the untold story because no one's done it yet. You know what I mean?
Well, the difference between, say, a movie that's plot driven and TV that's character driven is with television show like series like this, you want to know who Paul is. We're not as concerned, I don't think. Speaking for the team, we're not as concerned about everything he accomplished. We're not as
Mhm.
concerned. We're more concerned about who was the man, what was he up against, how did he surpass these barriers that were imposed on him or he imposed upon himself, And where did he achieve his greatest achievements? Where did that come from inside of him?
Mhm.
The plot part is a little less important to me because we want to know from his perspective what his life was like, what he was facing. And then maybe instead of the viewer being a fly in the wall to Paul's life, maybe they feel he can be relatable. Maybe they feel his struggles in his journey and the choices he's making, and they root for him, or they go, don't do that, or go this direction, whether physically or by faith. I want them to feel like they're kind of in the driver's seat of Paul's life while they're watching.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. I think it, because we've read some things about him, right? We do know, like, it's just like The Chosen, like, you know kind of what's going to happen, right? But what's interesting is like the things you don't know, or the things you thought you knew that you really didn't know, because we don't know. Like, what I love about this show is it has the opportunity to, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but like you can bring historical and cultural context to this to make it more real. And I guess my question to you is like, what challenge is that for you guys? Because I would think that would be super, like, you're used to like 18, 1900s. We there's some things in the 1800s we actually have pictures of. We don't have pictures of what it looked like in first century. You know what I mean? 30 AD or whatever it is, like wherever we're at in the journey, 50 AD, 60 AD. We don't have like pictures, but we have to create that for someone. What challenges is that for you?
Well, you're reminding me of my news writing days, because what I noticed is when I was working in a newsroom, a TV newsroom, is we all started writing like each other, because you just started pick up the language of other newscasters, whether it's your own station, other stations, and instead of like creating a story that's an authentically genuine story, you're basically mimicking what you're hearing. And I think that with this series, we don't want to do that. We want to tell the story of Paul the way it's been done. We want to tell the story of Paul the way others have told other stories from the Bible. I think for us, the imagination has to be, what was it like to be that man at that time? What would he be seeing? How would he be, surviving, struggling, moving forward in his life? And that comes from, like, I think it's soul searching. You have to, I mean, reading scripture is a big part of it. Having open conversations, I think, as a creative team is part of it. But you have to dive inside yourself and say, if I am him at that time, not looking at him, not somebody who's eyeballing his life, but if I'm making those choices, what was I looking for? Was I being understood? For example, like, one of the things that drives me about this story is I am a big fan of telling stories about people don't know, but also people that are genuinely and generally misunderstood by other people, who say things and feel like they're not tracking what I'm saying. They're misconstruing what I'm saying. And I find that frustrating in life, that if I'm saying something and no one's understanding me, I can't imagine how someone like Paul felt, when you have important things to share and to tell people who are around you, and you don't feel like you're being understood, or you don't feel like they're really grasping the gravity of what you're saying. That can be terribly frustrating. So that's a big part of the story that drives me, is how do we set the record straight? Like you said, at a time we don't have recorded evidence, we don't have any documentation, besides what we have to refer to, obviously, in the world's greatest book. But we have to just dive into ourselves, I think.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we're all human. At the end of the day, like, we all have all the emotions God given us, and we all can resonate. It's just like peeling back. It's easy to think about, oh, it's Saint Paul, and we see him like up on the thing, and we think, oh, he's Saint Paul. It's like, no, he was just like me and you. He still encountered Jesus. Jesus radically changed his life, and yes, he did amazing things for God and was used by him. But I think we have to remind ourselves, but he was still just human. He wasn't Jesus. He was just a man. And I think I love that you guys are trying to capture that. It's just so powerful. So I want to ask you this question, because I don't know, maybe other people are like me. When you get to the end of credits of a film or TV series, you see director. Most people know what that is, but you see producer, executive producer. Can you tell us, like, in layman's terms, like, what a producer does? What is your role when it comes to like this project?
Sometimes I say to people, what isn't it? Like, what am I not doing? I'm not acting. I'm not directing. I'm not writing. What
Yeah.
else is involved in bringing the project, Oscar's vision, to fruition? And that could be everything from having a hand in things to doing the manual labor myself of things. And it could be making sure we have the right location, making sure we have the right team of people around us, because the director is only supported by the team that we build underneath him. In this case, we have a DP already, but we need crew, and we need to have people who understand the time period we're in. We need a dialogue coach. Those are all things that I've either done or had parts in doing in other productions. And I know that at the end of the day, I think about when I was a kid, we watched 1977's Jesus of Nazareth. And at some point, I remember like a sports car in the desert and thinking, okay, that was a continuity issue. Like it would be my job to make sure like that doesn't happen, that we don't have that situation. If there's anything that's going to impede us, anything that's going to pose a problem, like for example, the location that we're talking about using, there's another event that's going on around the time of our production. Like my job to me, part of my job is let's make sure that production doesn't interfere with what we're doing, because they could. It could be a noise situation. It could be they're using a facility that we need to be using. So I feel like I'm problem solving A to Z, whatever that looks like, however it comes about, to make sure we get the best possible footage we need to get this story right.
Yeah, yeah. And my husband and I, we joke, we call them that person a CPS, the chief problem solver.
Okay.
So, I mean, I hear that because, it for me, I've been telling everybody, like, film world is new to me. So I'm going to ask, I'm trying to figure it all out myself. I'm like, when I interviewed Jordan last week, I was like, what's the director of photography do? Like, I'm Googling, you know, what do they do? And so it's, for me and you in layman's terms, like you might hear that and you'd be like, oh, they take pictures. It's like, no, they do so much. They do so much. And so I just was curious to know what your role would be. And thank you for explaining that. So, with this being a religious and historical series that we're doing, how are you, or what's in your mind when it comes to how do we make this, appeal to not just the person who does believe in Paul's story, they completely are full in, but how do we make it appealing for the person that maybe this is their only gateway to scripture, or their only gateway to knowing a transformative life through the gospel of Jesus?
It's definitely a delicate balance, because there's certainly things that are, I mean, the term I hear a lot now is coded language, and that can be a negative or a positive association with coded language. But there's certainly things we want to have in there that somebody who is devoutly religious, like my mom, for example, would watch this and say,
Mhm.
I understand, I'm tracking all of it. It's building on the foundation I know. So we have that audience that we're building on a foundation. Then we have the audience that we don't want to lose,
Mhm.
because they get tripped up by something that's coming from scripture, or coming from what the kids now call as canon. Like, what is canon, Paul? Like, what is the stuff that absolutely is part of the story that we have to include? I don't want that audience to get lost in the story. I want them to focus more on the pieces of the story, the pieces of the drama that we're assembling throughout the course of the series, that invite them in, that welcome them into the story, that have them rooting for the right people, rooting against the right people, or the wrong people, I guess. And not getting lost along the way, because as soon as we lose them, if you lose them in the first episode, they're not going to come back. So I want to make sure
Right.
that how that information, how that story is being delivered, scene by scene, we keep them along the way. There's something that's a thread all the way through, while we're still building on the foundation of our first audience.
Right. I think it's interesting because it's like you've said it before, but like you're attaching to that emotional part, and we all can relate to that. Oh, Paul's feeling sorrow. Well, I've been felt sorrow, or he's feeling anger because people don't. He's misunderstood. We've all been there. So I love that you're saying, hey, we're trying to like get people to connect to the things that they're familiar with, but not getting lost in all the jargon and all the things they might not understand, because if I know me, if I don't understand something and it's hard to understand when you're watching it, like you're like, oh, I don't know if this is for me. And like that, I think it is that challenging to honor the story that everyone knows, that you are hitting the marks, if you will, in scripture. Okay, this was said, this was said, this is said, but adding enough that someone who doesn't know scripture can still relate and love and connect with, right?
At the end of the day, I mean, the emotional response is what we want. We want people to be. I remember one of my talk show producers, executive producer, said, "We do this talk show, and we want people to feel mad, glad, or sad, because they have an emotional response. If they're mad about something they saw something that was a form of injustice, so they saw something that was inspiring. We want them to feel something. If they're not feeling something after watching this, we're doing something wrong in production
Right.
and post production."
Yeah, absolutely. So, with all that being said, I was talking to Jordan last week, and one of the questions and one of the things we talked about was, hey, like, and he brought it up, this story is unique because Paul, he goes through all different kinds of locations, right? Like, it's not like in The Chosen where they're all in, Israel. Like, they all look similar. Here we are talking about going to Greece. We're talking about going to Italy. We're talking about, he all these pilgrimages he takes. And like, my question is, how do we as a production team, and how do you like, how do we make that happen when we're a crowdfunded show. Like we don't have millions of dollars like Hollywood. How do we what is that challenge for us to make sure it's like historically accurate, but yet still like, being realistic?
What you want people to see. There's
Mhm.
a great book in my school I've been working at with kids with autism where you see a piece of something and then it goes out. So like the piece of something you're seeing, you can't quite tell what it is. You see a shape,
Mhm.
you see a color, you see tone, right? Some shadows, and you pull out and you see like it's a bunch of grapes. But you didn't really know that. And that's the magic of directing the eye and the way we can direct the eye, that we could take a single location and make it look like four different locations just by the direction we turn the camera in, or by how close up we go. If we
Mhm.
do a lot of wide shots in a place where we see modern things, we're going to run into trouble. If we do a
Right.
lot of tight shots, we're going to lose the bigger environment that, hey, we are back in Paul's time. So
Right.
I think it's striking that balance of where do we put the camera, where do we direct the viewer's eye to see what we want them to see, and how do we mask out the other things that are going to say to them, oh, that's not Bible times, that's 2024.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I found it interesting because I hadn't thought about it until Jordan brought it up that like, hey, like we're in all these different locations. And I was like, yeah, we are going to be. And it's going to be interesting, which I know we're talking about the first two episodes definitely being in one location. And we don't know in the future. We could be somewhere different. Right. And it always changes and morphs, of course, I'm sure, as the series will go on.
Mhm.
So what is like maybe one story about Paul that like you're super excited about capturing on camera? Is there anything that comes to mind?
We've had conversations about how big we can stage this. Like, what is going to be the most active way to tell the story? And I think for me, like when we did a little of a test shoot last year, I wasn't on set for that, but I was helping from a distance, and that Jordan and Ulysses did a test shoot in the piney woods of East Texas. It's not the look we would capture for this show, but it was more like a proof of concept of what we're trying to do. And to me, it's Paul reflecting in his own pain. Like I want to see scenes that are deeply moving, that are one man in pain and not communicating with dialogue, no voiceover. We're in a sparse area. He's trying to, in this particular shoot, he was trying to quench a thirst, and obviously that's very metaphorical. And that's things you can get away with, I think, in taking the story a little bit outside of scripture. Is that we're
Mhm.
trying to find ways to convey what he would have been experiencing at the time without necessarily pulling line for line and how we shoot that. I want to see us do things like that. But then we also talked about making it not so dialogue heavy. I know sometimes people do these productions about our figures of the Bible, and they make them really heavy on exposition. And we want people to understand like this was a very much a time of survival, and so there needs to be some sense of like people are desperate, circumstances are dire, things are life and death. If someone's chasing you, I want to feel like he's being chased. I want to feel like he's got a sense of panic and fear. We talked about incorporating animals and having stunts, having stunt horses, and things that would definitely almost border on more of an action
Mhm.
adventure type piece of the story. And I think that when people think about, at least how I was raised, it was very talk heavy. And I don't think life was as talk heavy as we've made it seem in television and film. I think that there was a lot more action going on, a lot more urgency, and I think we need to convey that urgency and how do we tell his story. So that's not two people in a at a temple talking. It might be somebody on the run. It might be somebody searching for something to drink because they feel like they're dying of thirst. It needs to be
Mhm.
human, the part of the human condition that is life and death and not safe. Because as soon as the audience feels safe, right, the story is over. We don't want them to feel safe either. We want them to feel like this too for you is life and death.
Yeah, yeah. I love that so much because it is true, right? I I think that means that you have to have amazing talented actors who are able to tune into those motions and those
Mm-hmm.
things. And I believe Ulysses, he has it.
Oh
He's
yes.
such a humble guy, but man, like he has that connection to Paul. And if you start getting him talking about Paul, he'll he'll talk your ear off. But he's so connected to him, and he's really been studying him, and then just trying to connect to that man. And so I think being able to portray that, like you're saying, without dialogue is so beautiful. In some ways, more powerful because you're connecting to that emotion, that person without words. Um,
He's stunning. I mean, I've gotten a chance to talk to him in person and seen some of his work, and those conversations we've had about his preparation to play Paul. And like this is what actors do, is they embody a character because they show up and they've done the homework. Ulysses does the homework. He
yeah.
goes to the nth degree to say, I'm going to find out who this guy is for me, how he shows
Mhm.
up in my life, and I'm going to be able to walk onto that set and take direction and bring ideas and be dynamic, and as he should be, as someone who's carrying the series. I've absolute confidence that he can pull this off, and I'm excited to see what he does on set.
Yeah, I am too because he's just the right guy, for the right season, I definitely think.
Yeah.
So, talking about Paul, is there something about Paul's story that you've read or that you're familiar with that has connected to you personally? I know you said you felt like he's been misunderstood and that connects to you, but is there something else?
Oh my goodness, yes. It's identity for me.
Mhm.
Identity is a big part of Paul's story, a big part of Paul's life, um, and a change in identity, right? So even something as simple as changing a name is a change in identity. So for me, I feel like I've gone my whole life with people assuming who I am
Mhm.
and representing myself in a way that matches what people assume, representing myself in a way that makes people feel comfortable rather than saying what's true and honest. I've done that a lot. The more I've gotten to know Paul, the more I realize like I feel some alignment with the challenge in being yourself when you're not sure who that is.
Mhm.
Being true to yourself and being true to your Lord when you're not exactly sure how to do that. What does that look like? I've questioned that many times. I remember being raised in a Catholic church, and I went to in summer camp. I went with a friend. I made a new friend, and she took me to a very different church, an evangelical church, and there was singing. I came home to my mom and I said, "Hey, we did all this fun stuff." In
Mhm.
contrast to my very quiet, subdued Catholic church. And my mother was like, I think she was shocked. And it made me realize like I want to know how other people live. I want to know how where other perspectives are. But sometimes I feel like I put myself on the fence as a writer and watch it. Like I'm the guy on the fence and I'm watching the left side and right side and I'm just paying attention that way. It's different to be immersed in a situation where you're around people who are in one camp or the other and you're either with them or against them. That's harder thing to do, and that's I think the more I've learned about Paul, also something I think a lot about is it's hard to stand up and be yourself. It's really hard to stand up with people who may not have the same conviction as you, who may not have the same beliefs as you, who may misunderstand who you are. Those are all very challenging things, and especially in this day and age, I feel like social media doesn't make it any easier. People get a snapshot of who they think we are. And we're always, what I learned in sales is we're always overcoming objections. People have objections to us because they think, we like a different team than they like, or, we voted for a different person than they voted for. So there's always that sort of, that shortcut to sizing us up. And we have
Mhm.
to be people who are, courageous and brave enough to say, this is who I am. Love me or not, take it or leave it. This is who I am. And I think to me, that's part of his story is that thinking of it. It's not easy to say who you are, not easy to say what you believe in, but it's worth the pain. It's worth the challenge at the end.
Yeah, I think especially with Paul growing up his whole life with this achievement thinking he was doing it was his culture, this thing, and he believed in it 100%. And then he has this encounter with Jesus, and then 3 years go by, and he has to like almost like disassemble everything he thought because everything got changed. And then he's like, "So who am I now?" And he had to know who he was because he faced severe, you know, uh, uh, people who came against him, opposition. And so like he had to be able to stand firm because if he didn't, he wasn't going to make it. And I mean, he stood so firm that to points of death multiple times. And so yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from Paul when it comes to that. The other thing I think we can learn from Paul is I think about him on Mars Hill. I think about how eloquent he was with I can be who you are. I like with the fair whether it was the religious people, the Jewish people, or the Romans, it's like I know who you are, I know where you've been. And like, but let me explain to you where I'm coming from. And I think Paul was so good at relating to people. And you were saying all this stuff about social media. I think everybody's so against like we're all polar opposites, and it's like, oh, you're here or there. But like, what's wrong with understanding other people's perspectives too? You know what I mean? Like, what's wrong with standing and say, I might not agree with you, but I can listen to you, right? And I think Paul teaches us that, and he teaches us what it looks like to stand stand firm, to not back down, but to not be a jerk about it. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
yeah, exactly. I want to hear him say that actually. Come on, don't be a jerk about it.
Yeah, yeah. I
That
think
won't be
that's
in
a
our
great
dialogue,
line.
but that would be kind of funny to
They
say.
they should write that in 100%. Yeah. Well, I like that you mentioned that about Paul as identity. No one's talked about that yet, and I think that's really a powerful part of who Paul is. So, with that being said, you're working on this series. What is a hope for you? Like, what kind of legacy, if you will? I mean, for us, this is more than just a normal show. I mean, for us, it means something to us deeply as believers. We are hoping that this is like eternal, lasting. So, what are some things you're hoping that it will do and last in legacy?
Well, I had a chance to work on a show, like a series of holiday specials for a Christian media organization
Mhm.
a couple years ago, and it was a very different animal because it was a short version. It was real conversation, kind of like this. It was real conversation, but the thing that's missing was for me the narrative part of the story, where you're telling a story through the embodiment of actors. And while I like that other experience, and I've done that kind of producing and directing, for me, like building something, being on the ground floor of something like this that might move people, and it might move somebody an inch to the left or right or forward. It might move them just a hair. It might inspire someone else to do something bigger, to take some
Mhm.
bigger actions in their life, to have more faith in their life. It might make someone else decide, hey, I want to write something like that. So for me, like legacy is kind of multi-tiered in the way that I want people to engage with this. However, wherever we meet them on the road, we're bringing this to them. We're bringing this show to them. They get a chance to see it, interact with it, feel like they've got some investment in it because they like the characters, they like the story, they're rooting for us, they're rooting for Paul, and however it moves them in a way that's measurable. Like I said, even
Mhm.
an inch or two, and does something different in their lives. If they just watch it and don't think about it, that's okay too, and that happens as well. But if there's some sense of like, let's be mindful while we're watching this and think about what it means. What does this story mean to me, and how do I
Mhm.
want to take this story into my life? Where do I want to place it in my life? Um, and it doesn't have to be big gestures. Like I know some people want the big gesture of awards, some of the big accolades. And my thought is, if we're just telling good stories and we're being true to ourselves and we're doing the things we want to do and we're enjoying the mission that we're on and getting this story out, I think that's a success in itself. Getting one season is a huge success these days, as we know so many things are getting canceled. We get one
Mhm.
season out of this. That's a first big accomplishment. That's a pretty nice legacy to start with.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Well, Mark, I have enjoyed our time together. As we wrap this up, I have one question for you. So, if you
Sure.
had like 60 seconds and you had an opportunity to share with somebody, encourage somebody, like, hey, watch this show, help support this show, like, what would you say to them?
Paul the Last Apostle is not just a show about Paul, it's a show about you. It's a show about your choices, your connection to your faith, your connection to God, your life that you're leading right now. This is not meant to be a page out of the Bible. If it was a page out of the Bible, we'd direct you to the Bible. What we want you to do is we want you to feel his pain. We want to feel his accomplishments. We want you to be satisfied at the end that we wrapped up the story in every episode to make you feel like you had some of your hunger subside, and then you're ready for the next episode after that. And by the end of the season, we want you to be so riveted by Paul's journey that you demand that there's more episodes.
I love that. That's so good. That's so good, Mark. I appreciate our time together. For those of you who are watching or maybe tuning in later, today we had Mark, our producer. I'm so excited about our next interview. It's going to be with Santiago Ramirez Snidero, and he is our director, and it's going to be so good. So stay tuned. We had put it on for Friday. It might be a little bit later, so please follow along. We'll be posting about it very soon. But Mark, again, it was such an honor to have you today. So thank you for joining us.